It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other from their driveways, where the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and the hum of sprinklers filled the morning quiet. Lane looked perfect from the outside, rows of identical houses with white fences, tidy gardens, and SUVs gleaming under the sun. It was the kind of place where everyone thought nothing horrible could happen. But behind one of those closed doors, something dark had already started to grow. A mix of arrogance, resentment, and pride that would soon destroy more than just reputations. The man at the center of it all was named Richard Harlan. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of confidence that made him seem untouchable. To his neighbors, he was the smart one, the guy who always knew his rights and didn't hesitate to tell everyone else when they were wrong. He worked as a real estate agent, but if you listened to him talk, you'd think he was a lawyer. He often said things like, "I know the law better than half the cops in this town," followed by a laugh that didn't quite sound friendly. At first, people admired him. He spoke with certainty, always sure of what he was saying, and when small disputes came up in the neighborhood, like property lines or noise complaints, Richard was the first one to step in, quoting legal codes as if they were gospel. But admiration slowly turned into irritation. His confidence had a way of crossing lines. He didn't just know the rules. He used them like weapons, twisting every situation in his favor, always reminding people that he was in the right. His wife had once been seduced by that confidence. Back when they met, he was charming, full of plans and ambition. She was quiet, practical, and grounded, the kind of person who kept things running while he chased ideas. They'd been married for nearly 15 years now, but lately their home had turned cold. There were no more dinner conversations, no shared laughter. Only silence and the constant clicking of Richard's keyboard as he worked late into the night in his office downstairs. Neighbors said they'd sometimes hear shouting, muffled through the walls. Nothing too alarming, just the usual tension of a couple under stress. But's eyes told a different story. When she came outside to collect the mail or walk their dog, she carried a look that was hard to describe, like she was somewhere else entirely, watching her own life from a distance. Richard had recently been in a dispute with the local homeowners association. It started with something small, a warning about his unapproved fence extension. But Richard didn't take warnings lightly. He fired back letters full of citations, threats of legal action, and demands for meetings. He called the HOA president an incompetent clown in front of everyone at the last neighborhood gathering. To him, it wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about control. About showing everyone that he couldn't be told what to do. At first, tried to calm him down. "It's just a fence, Richard, let it go," she'd said one night, her voice tired. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "It's about principle," he said, his tone sharp. "You don't just let people walk over you." That was how he saw the world, a battlefield of power and submission. Every argument, every interaction was a chance to prove he was smarter, stronger, above the rest. Their teenage son had started spending more time at his friend's house down the street. He avoided dinner, avoided the silence, avoided his father's eyes. He was 17, old enough to understand when things weren't right. Sometimes he'd overhear the way his father spoke to his mother, slow, cutting words that sounded polite on the surface but carried poison underneath. "Maybe if you thought before speaking, we wouldn't have these problems," Richard would say, his voice low but heavy. Never replied. She'd just nod and walk away, her hands trembling slightly. The tension at home grew worse when Richard's arrogance began spilling into his work. A deal had fallen apart a few weeks ago, something about a misrepresented property and an angry client threatening to sue. But instead of taking responsibility, Richard boasted that he'd handle it easily because, as he said, "I know the law." He sent out emails filled with legal jargon, filed pointless counterclaims, and called his client's lawyer a wannabe during a meeting. His coworkers stopped answering his calls after that. People in town had started whispering about him. The once respected real estate agent had turned into someone people avoided. He didn't see it, though. He thought everyone else was just jealous or ignorant. "They hate smart men," he told one evening as he poured himself a drink. She didn't answer. She just watched the amber liquid swirl in his glass and thought about how he used to be before all this, before the ego, before the constant need to win. The air in their house seemed heavy lately, as if even the walls were holding their breath. There were small things that hinted at something breaking. Richard's raised voice echoing through the hall, a glass shattering in the sink, the sharp slam of a door. He started sleeping less, spending his nights hunched over legal documents, muttering to himself. Began keeping a small bag in her closet, just clothes, some cash, and important papers. She never said why, but deep down, she already knew she might need to leave soon. On the surface, life still looked normal. The lawn was trimmed, the mailbox polished, the family car washed every Sunday. But inside, the pressure kept building. Everyone felt it, though no one said it out loud, that sooner or later something would snap. And then came the day that would change everything. It started quietly like any other morning. The sun rose over Lane, spilling light across the perfect lawns. Birds chirped, sprinklers clicked on, and Richard stepped out of his front door, adjusting his tie. He had a court hearing that day, a small civil case when he insisted on fighting himself. "No need for a lawyer," he'd said with a smirk. "I know the law." He believed that completely. He believed it when he walked into that courtroom. He believed it as he stood before the judge, his voice full of confidence and pride. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that before the day was over, all that pride would be stripped away. And when the verdict came, it wouldn't just be about the case. It would be about everything he'd built his life around, his control, his image, his belief that he was untouchable. The fall was coming, and everyone who had ever crossed paths with Richard Harlan would soon watch as the man who claimed to know the law faced the one thing he never saw coming, justice that didn't bend to his will. The morning of the hearing marked the beginning of a shift that no one could ignore. Richard left the courthouse that day with a thin, bitter smile stretched across his face. The judge had spoken sharply to him, cutting through his attempts to grandstand, but the case was postponed, not dismissed. In Richard's mind, that meant he hadn't lost. He walked out certain he'd been misunderstood, that the judge was just another part of a system too blind to see his brilliance. But inside, something fragile had cracked. For the first time in years, someone had made him feel small, and that wound would soon infect everything around him. When he got home, could sense it. He didn't speak to her when he walked in, just dropped his bag on the couch and poured himself a drink. His movements were sharp, impatient. She asked softly, "How did it go?" He took a long sip before answering. "The judge doesn't know what he's talking about," he muttered. "Arrogant idiot, I'll show him next time." She nodded, as she always did, but in her chest, fear stirred. It wasn't just anger she heard in his voice, it was humiliation. And humiliation, she'd learned, made Richard dangerous. That evening, while he worked in his study, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the same untouched cup of tea. She'd been thinking of leaving for months, but something always stopped her. Sometimes it was fear of what he might do, fear of being alone. Other times it was guilt. Despite everything, part of her still remembered the man he used to be, the one who once brought her flowers after work and said he couldn't imagine his life without her. But that man had disappeared long ago, buried under years of resentment and pride. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The court case over the fence spiraled into a full-blown legal mess. Richard refused to back down. He wrote long, angry letters to the city council, the HOA, even local news outlets, claiming he was being targeted and harassed. He filled the house with printed documents and binders labeled evidence. The dining table became a war room, wasn't allowed to touch anything. If she tried to tidy up, he snapped at her, saying she didn't understand legal processes. The neighbors had started avoiding him completely. They crossed the street when they saw him coming. Even the mailman barely made eye contact, but Richard didn't care. In fact, he took it as proof that he was right, that everyone else was scared of him because he knew too much. First real explosion happened one Sunday afternoon. Had gone into his office to bring him lunch. He was packing the room, muttering under his breath while scrolling through his laptop. When she set the plate down, he turned sharply and shouted, "Don't touch my desk." She froze, startled. He glared at her, his face red. "You always do this, sneaking around, messing with my things." Her voice trembled as she said, "I was just bringing you food." He slammed his hand on the desk. "I don't need your help." That night she slept in the guest room, heard everything from upstairs. He didn't go down. He just lay awake, listening to the heavy silence that followed. As the weeks went on, Richard's obsession deepened. He started staying up all night researching laws, reading court transcripts, and watching legal videos online. He stopped eating properly, his eyes dark with exhaustion. He'd whisper things like, "They think they can beat me? They don't know who they're dealing with." Sometimes would find him sitting in the dark, staring at a blank wall, his lips moving as if he were rehearsing an argument no one else could hear. Money was becoming a problem, too. Richard's reputation in town had taken a hit after the argument with the client who threatened to sue. Several property deals fell through, and his boss had called him in for a serious conversation. But Richard brushed it off, claiming he'd just start his own firm. He told he didn't need anyone else, that soon they'd be free from all the idiots who stand in the way. But their savings were dwindling fast. Bills piled up and quietly took extra hours at the local library where she worked part-time. She didn't tell him. If he found out, he'd take it as an insult. One evening came home later than usual. Richard was sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. "Where were you?" he asked without looking up, hesitated. "At's place, we were studying." Richard scoffed. "Studying, huh? Probably me like everyone else in this neighborhood." Jaw tightened. "No, Dad, not everything's about you." The room went cold. Richard looked up, eyes sharp. "Watch your tone," he said. "You don't talk to me like that." Didn't respond. He just turned and walked upstairs. Richard's voice followed him. "You think you're better than me? You think you know the law? You know nothing." After that, barely spoke to his father at all. He avoided him like a ghost, slipping out early, coming home late. The tension between them grew thick, like a fog that never lifted. Noticed something new in Richard, paranoia. He started checking the windows before bed, locking every door twice. He claimed people were watching the house, that the HOA was spying on him, that the judge was in on it. One night he made her stand by the window with him, pointing toward a car parked down the street. "You see that? They've been there for an hour. They're taking pictures." She squinted through the dark but saw nothing unusual. "Richard," she said softly, "no one's out to get you." He turned to her, eyes wild. "That's exactly what they want you to think." Began keeping a diary, just small notes hidden between book pages. She wrote down everything he said, everything he did, as if preparing for something inevitable. The bag in her closet grew heavier, an extra set of keys, a burner phone she'd bought secretly, a printed copy of her son's passport. She wasn't planning to leave yet, but she wanted to be ready. Meanwhile, the case reached a new phase. The court had scheduled the final hearing, and Richard was confident this was his moment to expose everyone. He rehearsed his speech in front of the mirror, practicing how he'd talk down to the judge, how he'd make the HOA's lawyer look like a fool. Watched him from the doorway, realizing how far gone he was. There was no reasoning left in him. The man standing there wasn't her husband anymore. He was a stranger fueled by ego and rage. The night before the hearing, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. Richard sat in his office, surrounded by papers, his eyes bloodshot, walked in quietly. "You should rest," she said. "It's late." He didn't answer. She tried again. "You'll think more clearly in the morning." He finally looked at her and said, "You don't get it. None of you do. Tomorrow, everything changes." That sentence stuck with her long after she went to bed. She lay awake, listening to the storm and the faint sound of him talking to himself downstairs. The next morning, he didn't eat. He dressed in a dark suit, slicked back his hair, and left the house without saying goodbye, stood by the window and watched him drive away. She didn't know why, but her stomach churned with dread. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. It was Richard's boss. He wanted to know if Richard had mentioned anything about quitting, hesitated. "No," she said quietly. "Why?" The man on the other end sighed. "He's been sending out some strange emails, accusing clients of fraud, threatening lawsuits. We can't have that. I think he's not well." Hung up slowly, her hands shaking. She realized just how deep the spiral had gone. When Richard returned that evening, he was silent. He poured himself another drink, sat on the couch, and stared at the wall. "They laughed at me," he said finally, his voice hollow. "The judge, the lawyer, all of them." He looked up, his expression hardening. "But I'll show them." From that night on, the house changed completely. He began keeping his study locked. Could hear the sound of paper shredders, the clatter of drawers, the packing of footsteps at 3 a.m. She asked him what he was doing, but he just smiled and said, "You'll see soon enough." Grew worried for his mother. One night he whispered to her, "Mom, we should go." She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "Not yet," she said. "Just not yet." But she knew the truth. The breaking point was coming. You could feel it in every silence, in every slammed door, in every glance that lingered too long. Richard was unraveling, his pride turning into obsession, his obsession into madness. He once said he knew the law, but now he was building his own version of it. A world where he was always right, where everyone else was corrupt, and where justice could only come from him. And once a man starts believing that, there's no telling how far he'll go to prove it. The night it happened began like so many before it, quiet, tense, and heavy with unspoken words. The house was still, save for the faint ticking of the hallway clock and the hum of a storm brewing outside. Richard had spent the day packing the living room, muttering to himself about the court's biased system. He'd lost his final hearing. The judge had ruled against him, dismissing his case entirely. It wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a personal humiliation. He had walked into that courtroom certain he would crush everyone who doubted him, but the judge had cut him down, calling his arguments baseless and misguided. When he left, people had looked at him differently, some pitying, others amused. That laughter echoed in his head all afternoon, louder than the thunder now rolling through the dark sky. When he came home, new. She saw it in his eyes before he said a word. Something had snapped. His pupils were small, his expression fixed in a cold, distant calm that scared her more than his anger ever had. He walked past her without speaking, straight into his office and slammed the door shut. She heard drawers opening, papers shuffling, and then silence. Stood in the kitchen, frozen. She had tried to leave before, but tonight something felt final, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. She thought about upstairs, about how quiet he'd been lately, how he'd barely spoken since the last shouting match. She wanted to go to him to tell him to pack a bag, but before she could move, she heard the sound of glass shattering. She turned toward the hallway. Richard's voice followed, a low, guttural growl. "They think they can humiliate me. They think they can take everything from me." She hesitated, her heart pounding. "Richard," she called softly, no answer. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows, steady and relentless. She took a few cautious steps toward the office. When she pushed the door open, the air inside was suffocating. Papers were scattered across the floor, the computer screen glowing white against the darkness. Richard stood by the desk, gripping a framed photo of the three of them. His hand was bleeding, shards of glass from the broken picture glinting on the carpet. "Do you see this?" he said, his voice trembling. "They ruined us, all of them, but I'll make it right. I'll make them pay." "Richard, please," said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's over. We can move on from this." He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "Move on, after everything I've done, after how they've treated me." He turned to face her, eyes wide, almost wild. "You think this ends with me losing? No, I'll show them what losing really means." For a moment she thought he might hurt himself. She took a step forward, hands out. "You don't have to do this, just stop, please." But something shifted in his gaze. It hardened, refocused, not on himself, but on her. "You never believed in me," he said quietly. "You've been against me all along, haven't you? You and that boy upstairs, whispering behind my back, laughing at me like the rest of them." Tears welled in her eyes. "No, Richard, that's not true. We just want peace. You need help." "Help," he snapped. "You think I'm crazy." The storm outside cracked open with thunder shaking the walls. Richard moved closer. His breathing grew heavier, his voice rising with every word. "You've been poisoning me, making me doubt myself. You think I don't see it? Every time you look at me with those eyes, like you're scared, like you pity me." She took a step back. "Richard, stop." But before she could finish, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The strength in his grip made her cry out. "You don't get to walk away from me," he hissed. She tried to pull free, but he shoved her against the wall, papers flying from the desk. The sound of the rain seemed to grow louder, the world narrowing to the pounding of her heart and his ragged breathing. Upstairs heard the noise. At first he froze, he'd heard arguments before, but this was different. There was something in his mother's voice, a raw fear he'd never heard before. He ran down the stairs, shouting, "Dad, stop it." When he reached the doorway, Richard turned, his eyes wild and glassy. "Stay out of this," he barked, but didn't stop. He grabbed his father's arm, trying to pull him away. The three of them struggled in the small office, knocking over the lamp, sending the room into flickering shadows. "Let her go," yelled. "Stay back," Richard roared, pushing him away. Stumbled, hitting the side of the desk, but he came back, desperate. Screamed, "Stop it, both of you!" But her words were lost in the chaos. In the scuffle, Richard's elbow struck the corner of the desk, knocking over the heavy glass paperweight he kept there, a polished stone globe he'd once called his symbol of control. It rolled onto the floor and stopped near his foot. Richard's gaze flicked down to it for a second, and something in him twisted, an impulse, dark and blinding. He grabbed it. Saw it too late, Dad. The sound that followed was sickening. The globe came down once, twice, before screamed and tried to pull him away. The world went silent except for her voice, raw and broken, echoing through the house. Richard froze, the paperweight slipping from his blood-smeared hand. It hit the floor with a dull thud and rolled into the corner. Lay still, fell beside him, shaking, her hands covered in red. "No, no, no," she sobbed. "Please, God, no." Richard stumbled backward, gasping for air. His mind reeled. He looked at his hands, then at the boy on the floor, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. "I didn't mean," he whispered. "He came at me. He tried to attack me." His voice cracked under the weight of his own lie. Turned to him, her face pale and wet with tears. "You killed him," she said in a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. "You killed your own son." Richard shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. He shouldn't have. He shouldn't have gotten in the way." He started packing, running his bloody hands through his hair, muttering, "It's not my fault. They'll twist it. They'll say it was murder. I have to fix this." He turned toward, eyes filled with a manic light. "We can make it look like an accident," he said. "He fell, you saw it, he fell." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're insane," she whispered. Richard moved closer, his tone suddenly calm, almost soothing. "Listen to me. If we both say the same thing, they can't prove anything. We'll tell them he slipped, hit his head." She slapped him. The sound cracked through the room like lightning. "You're a monster." For a moment he didn't move, then his face twisted in rage. "After everything I've done for this family, you turn on me too." He lunged toward her, but she was faster. She grabbed the paperweight from the floor and swung it with all her strength. It connected with his temple. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock, and collapsed against the desk. The room went silent again, except for the storm raging outside. Dropped the globe, her chest heaving, staring at both bodies, her husband unconscious, her son motionless. The smell of iron filled the air, mingling with the scent of rain seeping through the cracked window. Minutes passed before she moved. She crawled to his side, her trembling hands brushing his hair back. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over, rocking slightly. "I'm so sorry." Down the hall the clock ticked steadily, each second louder than the last. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, the thunder fading, the rain easing to a whisper. When Richard finally stirred, his head throbbing, the room was dim. He groaned, pushing himself up, and saw her sitting there beside, her face blank, her clothes soaked with blood. Something inside him broke for good then, not out of grief but out of realization. There was no undoing this. No law to twist, no argument to win. For once, the man who always claimed to know everything stood silent, staring at what his pride had destroyed. And outside, the storm finally stopped. The house was quiet again, but this time it was the kind of silence that never leaves. The hours that followed felt unreal, like time itself had stopped inside that house. Sat on the floor beside her son, unable to move, unable to think. Her hands trembled as she held him, whispering his name over and over as if the sound could somehow bring him back. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed against her chest. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, painting thin, pale lines across the blood-streaked floor. Richard sat slumped near the desk, his head bandaged from where she'd struck him. He hadn't said a word since waking. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, his face pale and hollow. Every so often, he looked at the motionless body of his son, then quickly looked away as if his eyes couldn't bear the truth. He muttered to himself, fragmented thoughts, half-formed justifications. "He shouldn't have, he grabbed me first, it was an accident." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. When finally spoke, her voice was empty. "We have to call someone." Richard's head snapped up. No police, they'll twist everything, you know they will." She turned to him slowly. "He's dead, Richard, our son is dead, there's no hiding this." He stood shakily, clutching the edge of the desk. If we clean this up, if we think maybe." "Stop," she said sharply, "just stop." Her voice cracked on the last word. "You can't fix this, you can't fix anything." For the first time in years, Richard had no response. He just stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes glassy. The man who once claimed to know every answer now stood speechless in the ruins of his own making. When the sirens finally came, the sun was up, had called them herself. Her voice on the 911 recording was barely recognizable, steady, eerily calm. "My husband killed our son," she said simply. "Please send someone." The officers who entered the house moved carefully, their voices low, their expressions grim. One led to the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, while another handcuffed Richard without a word. He didn't fight it. He just looked down, his hands trembling, his lips moving in silent disbelief. Neighbors began gathering outside, drawn by the flashing lights. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered in disbelief. The Harlans had been the family everyone knew, the confident husband, the quiet wife, the polite teenage son who mowed lawns in the summer. Now the perfect picture was shattered. The news spread quickly. By noon, local media trucks lined the street. Reporters stood under umbrellas, speaking into cameras with practiced solemnity. "Tragedy has struck a quiet suburban neighborhood," one reporter said. "A domestic dispute turned deadly in the home of Richard and Harlan." Richards appeared on every local channel that evening. In it, his once proud expression was gone. He looked lost, older somehow, as though years had passed in just a few hours. The caption below read, "Local real estate agent charged in son's death." Refused to watch the coverage. She She stayed at her sister's house in the next town, curled up in a guest room that smelled faintly of lavender. She didn't speak much. The detectives had interviewed her for hours, but her answers never changed. She told them everything, the argument, the struggle, the sound of the paperweight hitting flesh. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it again. At night, she dreamed of standing in the rain, calling out for her. She'd wake up gasping, clutching at the sheets. Her sister tried to comfort her, saying, "It wasn't your fault," but knew better. Maybe she hadn't swung first, maybe she hadn't meant for it to end this way, but she'd stayed too long. She'd seen the signs and done nothing. That truth haunted her more than anything. Meanwhile, the town couldn't stop talking. People who once waved to Richard at block parties now spoke of him like a stranger. "He always thought he was smarter than everyone," one neighbor said. "Guess that ego finally got him." Others were more sympathetic. "He must snapped," they whispered. "Maybe the pressure got to him." Richards were stunned. At the real estate office, his desk sat untouched, the nameplate still gleaming. His boss gave a brief statement to the press. "We're deeply saddened by what's happened. Richard was a valued member of our team. None of us saw this coming." But behind closed doors, everyone admitted they had seen something. The anger, the paranoia, the arrogance. They just never thought it would go this far. In jail, Richard changed quickly. In the first few days, he barely spoke. He refused food, spent hours staring at the wall of his cell. The guards said he kept muttering to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. His lawyer, one appointed by the court, tried to get through to him. "You need to cooperate," he said during their first meeting. "They have everything, the 911 call, your wife's statement, forensic evidence. The best you can do now is accept responsibility." Richard looked at him, eyes distant. "I know the law," he said quietly. "They can't prove intent." But the words no longer carried the same conviction. They sounded hollow, like a man reciting lines he no longer believed. As the investigation unfolded, the community's curiosity turned to discomfort. Parents whispered about how fragile their own families could be. Teachers at school held a memorial, placing flowers by his locker. His friends struggled to make sense of it. "He never talked about his dad much," one said, "but we all knew something wasn't right at home." The trial came months later, but by then the outcome was all but certain. The jury didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming, the story too clear to twist. When the verdict was read, guilty of manslaughter, Richard didn't react. He just stared straight ahead, expressionless. Sat in the back row of the courtroom, her hands clasped in her lap. When the judge asked if she wanted to make a statement, she declined. There was nothing left to say. The sentencing hearing was short. The judge spoke of pride, control, and the dangers of letting anger rule one's life. "You believed you understood the law," he said, "but you forgot that the law is meant to protect, not to serve your ego. And now, the law you claim to know so well will be the same one that takes your freedom." Richard was sentenced to 15 years. He didn't look at anyone as they led him away. After the trial, the media slowly moved on. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. The house on Lane sat empty for months, the lawn overgrown, the blinds closed. Eventually, it was sold to a young couple who knew little of its history, but some neighbors said they could never look at it the same way again. Never returned to that neighborhood. She changed her name, moved to a smaller town upstate, and took a job at a quiet bookstore. She lived alone, rarely speaking to anyone. Some nights, she'd sit by the window and watch the rain, her mind drifting back to the sound of laughter before everything went wrong. In prison, Richard became a shadow of himself. He spent most days in the library reading law books, not to find loopholes, but because they were the only thing that made him feel like he still had control. But the more he read, the more he realized how little power he'd ever truly had. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd see face. He'd hear his wife's voice saying, "You killed your own son." Those words followed him everywhere, in the clang of the cell door, in the echo of his own footsteps down the corridor. And in those moments, for the first time in his life, Richard Harlan stopped thinking about what the law said was right, and started to understand what it meant to be wrong. The world outside kept turning. The grass on Lane grew back, the whispers faded, and people moved on. But for the few who remembered, it was a reminder that pride can be more dangerous than any weapon, and that sometimes the worst crimes aren't planned at all. They happen when the need to be right becomes stronger than the will to love. The courtroom lights dimmed as the bailiff led Richard Harlan away in shackles, the sound of his chains echoing through the emptying room. That sound, the dull, metallic rhythm, marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but for those left behind, there was little comfort in the verdict. Stood outside the courthouse, the wind cold against her face. Reporters surrounded her like vultures, shouting questions that blurred together into meaningless noise. Do you feel justice was done? Will you ever forgive him? What would your son have wanted? She didn't answer. She simply kept walking, her heels clicking against the stone steps until the noise faded behind her. She wasn't sure what justice meant anymore. The man she had once loved was gone long before the sentence was passed, and the boy she'd raised, her only child, was buried beneath a patch of earth she visited in silence. In the years that followed, life continued, but not for her in the way it once had. Learned to move through the world like someone wading through fog, slowly, carefully, never certain of the ground beneath her feet. She attended therapy, though at first she said nothing in those sessions. Her counselor told her healing wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to live beside the pain. Eventually started to believe that. She moved into a small apartment overlooking a quiet park. On weekends, she volunteered at a shelter for victims of domestic abuse, women who, like her, had once believed control was love and silence was peace. When she listened to their stories, she recognized fragments of herself in their trembling voices, their uncertainty, their guilt. And each time she spoke softly to them, offering comfort, it was as though she were speaking to a past version of herself. Meanwhile, Richard's name faded from headlines, though his story became a kind of whispered cautionary tale. In law schools, his case was sometimes discussed as an example of domestic tragedy, a phrase that felt too clean, too academic to describe what had happened. In truth, it was not just a tragedy, it was a collapse. A collapse of pride, of power, of the illusion that control equates to order. In prison, Richard had changed in ways no one expected. The arrogance that once defined him had evaporated, leaving behind something raw and quiet. He spent his days reading philosophy and theology, trying to understand how a man who believed so deeply in reason could have acted with such irrational cruelty. He wrote letters to apologies that were never sent. He wrote to two, in notebooks the guards eventually confiscated when they realized he was talking to someone who no longer existed. One of the prison chaplains described him as a man finally learning how to feel. For Richard, that was both a punishment and a kind of grace. He began to see the moments leading up to the crime not as a blur of anger, but as a chain of choices, each one small, each one deliberate, each one rooted in pride. He had mistaken dominance for strength and silence for peace. By the time he realized it, everything that had mattered was gone. After serving 10 years, Richard was released on parole. The world had changed without him. The neighborhood he once lived in had new families, new laughter. His old house, painted a lighter color, no longer held any trace of his life. Was gone, her address unlisted, her name changed. He tried to find her once, but when his lawyer advised against it, he stopped searching. Deep down, he knew she had earned her peace, and he no longer had the right to disturb it. Instead, he took work at a library in a small town, shelving books under a false name. The anonymity suited him. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and lived with quiet repentance. Sometimes, when he saw fathers and sons walking together, a kind of ache would swell in his chest, an ache too deep for words. The tragedy of the Harlan family had rippled far beyond their walls. The community, once eager to gossip, eventually turned introspective. It became a conversation about the hidden fractures in homes that looked perfect from the outside, the pressures of success, the silent power struggles, the quiet wars fought behind closed doors. Psychologists and social workers cited the case in discussions about domestic violence and emotional control, emphasizing that abuse doesn't always begin with a blow. Sometimes it begins with a tone, a command, a word. In a broader sense, the story reflected an uncomfortable truth about society's expectations, particularly the illusion of the perfect family. People wanted to believe that success, appearance, and order were signs of virtue. But the Harlan case reminded them that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in politeness. Sometimes it smiles at neighbors and holds fundraisers. Sometimes it lives in the house next door. Her later years found a quiet strength in telling her story to others. She wrote an anonymous essay for a local paper titled "When Love Turns Silent." In it, she never mentioned names, dates, or places, only feelings. She wrote about the slow suffocation of control, the illusion of safety, and the moment she realized silence could kill just as surely as rage. The essay spread quietly, reaching far more people than she expected. Many readers wrote letters to the editor, sharing their own hidden stories. Some said her words had given them the courage to leave. That, more than any courtroom verdict, was her form of justice. The moral questions that emerged from the case lingered in legal and ethical discussions for years. Was Richard's punishment proportionate to his crime? Could a man who believed himself rational ever truly understand his own irrationality? Could love survive once power enters its veins? The answers varied, but one truth remained. Morality is rarely clean. It exists not in absolutes, but in the quiet spaces between decisions. Richard Harlan's downfall wasn't born of hatred. It was born of pride, of the belief that one person could control another's world without consequence. In the end, that pride destroyed them all. As the years passed, often visited's grave. She no longer cried there. Instead, she spoke to him softly about small things, the smell of rain, the sound of children playing, the way autumn leaves looked against the morning sky. She no longer asked for forgiveness. She only hoped that wherever he was, he knew she had tried. When she died, a small service was held. No reporters came. No headlines followed. But one person attended quietly in the back, an older man with tired eyes and weathered hands. He placed a single white flower on her coffin, bowed his head, and left before anyone could ask who he was. Some say redemption is impossible. Others believe it's earned through pain. But perhaps for people like Richard, and redemption is found in understanding, the kind that comes too late to change the past, but just in time to soften what remains of the soul. The story of the Harlans was not one of monsters, but of human beings, flawed, desperate, and searching for control in a world that rarely offers it. It stands as a reminder that beneath the veneer of civility, the capacity for harm lives in all of us, waiting for the wrong moment, the wrong word, the wrong spark. And in that recognition lies the story's truest horror and its quietest truth, that justice is not the end of the story. It is merely the beginning of understanding what it means to be human.